Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings. And this is another one that I was too lazy to actually scan the copy that I have, so here is the cover art, borrowed from the internet. Anyways, so Dragonquest is the sequel to Dragonflight, but what's interesting about it is that this is not an immediate sequel. This is a sequel that takes place literally about 7-8 years later. This book basically skips over nearly a decade of intervening time, and you see, in the last book, the thing that I didn't actually mention, Lessa travels through time because there is only one weir left. There were 6 to cover the whole planet, or at least the whole of the northern continent, and following 400 years, the intervals on Pern of having no thread are approximately 200 years long. And so when 200 years passed and thread didn't come back and more decades passed, everybody assumed there wouldn't be any more thread. But there was only one weir. And that weir gradually shrank in size and capability until when thread came back after the 400-year interval, it effectively, what it did was it took everybody by surprise, and they only had you had one group of people to cover, an entire continent's worth of so-called holds, that is, communal living giant cave apartments, basically. It's sort of these massive communal living apartment condominium type space. They're this weird combination of like cave systems and extracted living spaces, and they have these lord holders who are sort of like the dukes, except regional feudal lords, except that it's like an underground city, only kind of like a condominium or a castle. And it's a weird confluence of a bunch of different living notions all like mashed together. But anyways, the point is that you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people all over this planet, and you normally had 6 group of dragons because it meant that you didn't have one weir which was trying to do all the things. But anyways, Lessa traveled back in time to collect the other 5 weirs and bring them forward in time, which was why they had vanished from the timeline initially. It's one of those weird sui generis time paradoxes. They all vanished, but they wouldn't have vanished if she hadn't gone back in time to make them vanish, but she wouldn't have gone back in time if they hadn't vanished. So, it's the nature of time paradox. Anyways, and that's one of those endlessly circular paradoxes. Anyways, so what happens in this, though, is you have these Dragonriders that have been dragged forward 400 years in time, and the world changed. And it changed in that there had been 400 years without thread, without this hyper-aggressive fungus. And so the world had grown up in a way in those 400 years that these Dragonriders can't recognize. That you have these people who are used to there being no thread, have developed social mores, have stopped having quite the same respect for Dragonriders. And the thing is that it is partly respect, but it was also partly a somewhat slavish, obsessive dependence on them, because of course dragons are what keep what allow the people of Pern to prosper. That is, having these flying creatures manned by humans who go around and breathe fire on thread and keep it from landing on the ground to begin with, so that everybody else can move on with their lives. The issue that came up with this, of course, was that Dragonriders 400 years ago were very, very, very privileged. This is, in a way, this book is a particular example of privilege and how people can get used to certain ways of being, such that when something that they have that is a genuine privilege gets taken away from them, they feel like they've lost a right. And I'm not going to discuss the issue of racial privilege. I am talking here not about, not being mistreated by the police. I'm talking about, I walk into your home and I expect you to just hand me stuff because I ask you to. I'm talking about the privilege of the not merely wealthy, but of people of the noble class who could walk up to any random person on the street and say, I am a lord, give me the thing because I want it. And Dragonriders 400 years ago had been very much used to this. And they get pulled forward 400 years to a time when basically 3 days before was when Dragonriders collectively stopped being personae non grata and abruptly became indispensable again. You're talking about people who only 5 days before that had been talking about Dragonriders as parasites. And they find themselves faced with people who have this mentality that no, just because you have a dragon doesn't mean I'm going to give you stuff for free. And they don't know how to cope with it, and they become bitter. They become angry, and while some of them are young enough to make this adaptation, and the Weir leader Duram, who Weir leader being the title of the person in charge of a given Weir, Duram is, as the book says, too honest to say otherwise. But Falar, who is the Weir leader of Bendon, that Weir that actually had to live through that whole 400 years, that actually had to go through that time, he's grown up in a society where people called him a parasite. He's grown up with a fundamental understanding that holders and craftspeople have rights that these other Dragonriders really, really don't, and it creates this fundamental divide between them, and it eventually spurs a very serious, massive social crisis, because these people who have been pulled forward in time really don't understand the social shifts that have happened over those 400 years. They don't understand the gaps. They don't understand what they've missed. And it's sort of one of the most central and interesting points in this book, that you have these people who are partly relying on tradition because it's something familiar in what has abruptly become an incredibly unfamiliar world, but it's also just about how dramatically things can change, and those of us at the opposite end of the change don't always realize how dramatically different things are. It's like the people I periodically see online who are trying to write supposedly period fiction and are using Ms., little realizing that Ms. is in effect an invention of the 1970s, and that if you used it at any point before the 1970s, no one would know what you were talking about, and that nobody was called Ms. before then. And you don't realize it because things are the way they've always been during your lifetime. And if you take somebody who didn't live through a shift, they will be entirely discommoded and unable to really understand what's going on. What we're doing is we are bringing somebody forward from the year 1600 to the present and asking them to look at all of the massive social changes that have gone on and not be completely baffled and perplexed and occasionally offended. Now, granted, I suspect the changes have been somewhat less on Pern between the pre-400 interval period and post, but it's really, really central to this book. There's also a whole thing about, the tragedy of Kilara, who is the worst werewoman ever. Kilara is one of those characters who is just, definably the worst. She's a terrible, terrible person, and, in retrospect, everybody winds up massively regretting ever letting her impress a dragon or encourage her to do certain things, because by her misbehavior, she precipitates a massive tragedy of the death of two queens, causes herself to wind up permanently in a state of, not catatonia, she's described as having no more, mind than a babe, so she's basically been functionally mentally damaged by this, and throws Breck, the young woman that Falar's brother fell in love with, she winds up in a catatonic state until they do something very, very drastic to force her out of it. It's all, the whole thing is just, it's very, very dramatic, but it's a plot line that's going on concurrent with what is, frankly, to me, the more interesting plot line, and that is the ongoing politicking between Falar, who is a modern Weir leader, and Tibor, who is the leader of the newly established Southern Weir, that their ongoing sort of battles with the so-called old-timers, who are cranky and recalcitrant and difficult and don't want to change, don't want to do things differently. And this book is basically about a sharp break with the old guard and forcing everything into a new idiom. And it's a very, very interesting book about a massive political shift. Of course, the climax of the book actually ends with Falar's brother Fëanor deciding to try to visit the so-called Red Star. Now, the Red Star is a planet with a particularly unusual orbital path, which is in effect causing the Threadfall, the aggressive fungus, to land on Pern. And everybody thinks what we need to do is send dragons over to, just burn it at the source. And it's a fight that Falar has, an argument that he has with a whole bunch of lords, which he manages to win by explaining the practicalities of, okay, if we're going to do this, then we're going to have this many dragons sent over to cover how much of that planet to deal with it. Do we even know what's on the planet? Do we know what's there? How much fire would we need? And, manages to get the lords to back down by pointing out the pragmatics of it. But Fëanor going there and basically being, burned within an inch of his life kind of puts an end to the whole argument, which is, frankly, a good thing, because it's a dopey argument. Anyways, so that's all that I'm going to say about this, and I will see you all next week.